everybody, Robert with RC Archery. In this week's Tuesday's tip of the week, I'm going to give you 6 steps on how to use a hinge release the best way for you. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about today is using the natural rotation of a hinge to work with you through your shot execution. And what I mean by that is all these releases that you see as a hinge release are designed to work with a certain type of motion, finger pressures, angles, and they're all set up a little bit differently, but I'm going to give you an idea of what I mean by this process so that you can kind of see it on here, and I'll explain what it looks like on this release. So this release itself is actually a true ball fulcrum flex. This hinge release is actually my favorite for a few different reasons. One of them is if you look at the way the release is set up right now, the way the hook is on this release, this is pretty much level right here, the way that it would hook onto your D-loop. Now you can adjust it a little bit different ways, but if you're just looking at general, natural, neutral position, you're looking somewhere in this area. Now, one thing to point out really fast is the index finger is actually sitting much lower than the middle finger. And the reason that I like this release is this setup right here. Because when I go to execute this release and I start to balance pressure out and I start using the outside of the release, so meaning anything this side of the hook, this finger bed being lower on my index allows me to be able to rotate this release really naturally, because as my fingers want to balance out in height, the release is just rotating on itself. So a lot of archers that I see that get a hinge release, they actually have to fight the release because they're setting it up to draw with too much tension in the outer part of their hand, and they're over rotating this hinge. When you over rotate the hinge, you're going to work against the natural rotation of what it's trying to do, and then you're going to have to increase it by, making a fist, curling a finger, really fighting to pull through, and we absolutely don't want to do that. Now on the flip side of that, if you set the release a little too hot, then that gives some problems too, but we're going to go over that later in this video when we talk about speed setting and how to execute our shot. Now you may have heard me mention in the last segment finger pressures and the way that you're weighting the release. That really has a big thing to do with how a hinge release works for you. When you get the finger pressures weighted correctly, it's a lot simpler to use one of these releases. So what we're looking at when we're looking at weighting the fingers the correct way on a hinge is you want to be able to first and foremost draw it back with majority of your pressure on your index finger. Index and thumb, I don't use my thumb a ton, but I do use my index finger a lot, and that's when I'm drawing it back. But when I get to full draw and when I start to anchor in, I need to make sure that the outside of my release is engaged. So I'm gonna have some extra pressure adding into the release with my middle finger, or if it's a 3 or 4 finger, your ring and your pinky fingers. You don't need to rotate it and crank it down, but you need the fingers engaged. And what I mean by that is just having a little pressure there to where you can feel the release, the finger bed on here pushing into the finger itself. And that's going to help you engage. And then when you start to execute your shot, the pre-weight of that outside of that release is going to naturally allow you to work through the rotation, and it's going to keep you from having to manipulate the release and kind of crank down on it or do anything crazy that can affect your accuracy. When you start adding pressures into these releases the wrong way, then you can change how you're coming away from the face or digging into the face, or you can start pulling up on them or down on them. When you're doing all of that, you're controlling the end of the arrow where the knock and everything is, obviously, but that end of that arrow is super sensitive. So any small movements on the end there have big impacts downrange. So you can see if you're pulling up on the release, your arrow is going to hit low. If you're pulling down on it, it's going to hit high, and the same for left and right. So another thing that we want to keep in mind and be looking at here is not getting too weighted on your index. If you're not engaging these outside fingers because you're too much of the weight of what you're holding with the release back at full draws on your index, you can pull and do anything you want to, but you're really fighting that index release, and you can get some tremors and some shakes in your sight picture because you're tense here in this hand, and you see that develop really fast downrange. Now, what I like to do is draw it back, again, with a lot of the pressure on the index, but my finger and my hand is more or less relaxed as I draw it back and I get into anchor. So my index finger is not tense, and it's not creating that tremor or that shake downrange. One thing that I will say too is when you're holding these releases in your hand, I use the ring, this little portion here along the fingers here on my middle or my ring finger, depending on the release. I use that as my guide point as far as putting it on the edge of the finger bed. So the way that looks for me is like this. You'll see that it's right here. And when I hold the release, my index is more so away from it and over here because of the shape of my hand, but it creates a natural hook in there so that I'm pulling. Now I'm not cranking down on it to where my fingers are really deep in the release and you can kind of see the knuckles wanting to face forward. If you do that, it makes it really hard to hold the release and have a good hand posture. You'll also see that if I'm holding the release correctly here, my hand is relatively flat, but if I start to crank down on it, it starts to bend up at these base knuckles. So that can cause us some issues too, especially with how we're anchoring and how we're executing. So those are some things to keep in mind, as well as just how you're weighting this release when you're drawing the bow back and then as you're starting your execution. All right, so here's the big question that everybody has when they get one of these hinge releases and they come to me and start talking to me about how do I use it, and it's the speed setting of the release. I get a lot of emails and I get a lot of messages saying, hey, where do you have the speed set on your hinge? And I don't mind answering the question, but I always preface it, or at least include in my answer, this is how it works for me personally, and do not be afraid to deviate from what I am doing, especially even if it's a lot. Because everybody's hand's built differently, every release is a little bit different, and how you're executing is different too. Now, for me personally, with a 2-finger hinge release and the way that I'm using this release, it's probably a lot hotter on the setting than if you had a 3 or a 4-finger release when you're using it. Well, in fact, I know it's probably a lot hotter than what you're using if you're utilizing the correct weighting of your fingers. And the reason that is because we just don't have a lot of leverage over the outside of the release. So you're naturally not rocking the release as much with the way that it's flowing through our hand and the shape of the curve on our hand. That's one of the reasons I really enjoy shooting with 2 fingers, is because I don't have a lot to worry about there. I'm just worrying about my index, my middle finger, and utilizing the pressures correctly and everything in there. So finding your perfect speed setting is going to be important. And the way that I like to do this is kind of twofold. And one is an initial base setup. It's going to be a little bit safer. And then you're kind of working back to what's going to be optimal and ideal for you. Now, I recommend using a string trainer. I personally use a Morin string trainer, and I'll put a link to that down in the description of this video. You can purchase those at Lancaster Archery. They're really cool in that they allow you to have a holding weight that you can pull on there, and you can order from different ones and get different holding weights, but you can use just a piece of string and just, get it roughly to the right draw length and loop length that you're using to where you're utilizing the correct form and the placement of your body. But you can start by adjusting the release and leaving it slow. And I like to draw it back with, again, my thumb and my index finger. I'll have the outer fingers slightly engaged on it just a little bit. They're kind of just softly floating on the release. And I'm going to draw that release back. And what I'm looking for is to be able to get to anchor. And then when I let off the thumb peg and I lightly start to engage my outer fingers, I get to a click. Now, I use a click and release as a consistent starting point. Some archers can't use that. So if you're someone that's battling target panic and you don't need that consistent starting point because you need to just focus and utilize on pulling, that's a totally different story. And I have videos that talk about that on my YouTube channel. And I mean, there's a lot of information in that. But just for simplest ideas of what we're doing, for me, that's how I like to utilize the release, because from there, I know that I'm engaged on my outer fingers, my hand is set up in the correct place as I'm getting into anchor, and then I'm going to have a consistent shot timing window from that point. And when it comes to the window and what I'm looking for, I have a video that I've done where you can find your own. I'll link that here. You can view that video. I'm going to have a follow-up to that later on here on these Tuesday tip of the weeks, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on it so that you can get an idea of why I'm setting my release up at certain times and for certain windows based off normal shot and a shot under pressure. So I have a method in my madness there. But speed setting, again, start slow, start working your way back faster to where you're getting to anchor and you're utilizing good tension on the bow and developing good back tension and good pressure in your body. You're not loosening off on that tension as you're letting off the thumb peg. Some people will do that. I mean, it's natural to want to do that because you start trying to protect your shot, not wanting to go off. But as you're using the adjustments of the release, that's the perfect time to stay really firm and really solid in your shot and adjust it to where it gets a little bit faster to the point to where You're either getting to that click at the appropriate time whenever you're letting off the thumb peg and adding in that pressure to the outer fingers, or you're getting to a point to where you can relax off of that thumb point, add the pressure onto the outer fingers without a click, and then start working through your shot and it not take too long to where you start shaking and falling apart. All right, so now we've come to how to draw the bow back. And I've talked about this a little bit on our finger pressure segment, but I want to give you a visual of me drawing my bow back so you can see that, and then also kind of walk you through what I'm feeling and what it looks like and how to do this safely. So first and foremost, again, I would start with the string trainer. If you're new to a hinge release or new to that, that specific hinge release even, start with the string trainer, make sure that your speed setting is okay, what you're doing with your finger weighting and everything is okay, so you don't have any issues, any bad, misfires, or, get yourself hurt or anything crazy like that. So when you get to your bow or when you're using that string trainer, again, I'm gonna draw it back. A lot of that pressure is on the index finger. I hardly have any pressure on the thumb. There's a little bit there, and then there's a little bit on the middle finger. If I take it off, you'll see it rotate forward, and I'm kind of here. It's 80% index, 10% thumb, and the other 10% maybe on the middle finger. It might be 15% thumb and 5% middle finger, but that's kind of how it is. And then as I draw it back and get to anchor and I come off my thumb peg, I'm going to kind of engage that middle finger and make sure that my index finger is relaxed and make sure that I have a good flat hand and everything is anchored the right way. Another thing that I do, and a reason I like this 2-finger release, is these outer fingers are hanging off the end of this release, and it allows me to relax my palm and kind of let my hand stretch out and get back here into anchor. And that lets me have a softer hand. And then as I execute my shot, and what we'll talk about in the next coming segments is how I'm executing with that hand being relaxed and what I'm using kind of as a focal point. But I'm going to show you one more draw here. I'll do it without talking so you can kind of see it, and I'll get all the way into anchor so you can kind of see that whole process. Pay attention to my fingers, my hand, kind of the way that I'm weighting everything and holding it, and I'll try to do it slow enough where you can kind of see what's moving and what's happening there. One of the things that I noticed on that one that I wanted to talk about really fast that I haven't yet is I mentioned in the finger pressure segment where my index gets, it's holding the release, but it's not tense, so it's kind of soft. And what you'll feel when you're actually drawing that way is you'll feel the release press into the finger pad or into the finger bed of your index. And it's kind of compressing it and flattening it out. If you don't feel that you're holding too much tension in the index, that's something to really look for, because when we go to execute our shot, if that index finger is tense, it's going to be really hard to allow the natural rotation of the hinge release to allow it to happen and work for you, because you're actually going to be holding it shut basically with the index being too tense. All right, so the next step that I like to talk about is anchoring. And one of the reasons that I like to talk about this subject is it's slightly controversial in the archery world. But I think a lot of people either they have the wrong idea of what they're trying to accomplish, and they're still trying to accomplish the same goal, but they're using their body and the biomechanics of their system and what they're trying to accomplish inefficiently. So the way that I anchor with my release and the way that I teach the people that I coach and work with to anchor is kind of a light bulb moment for most people. As soon as I show them this and get them to use this, everybody that I've done this with all say the same thing. My hold is steadier, I feel more connected, and when I'm executing my shot, I'm getting less variance, especially left and right. So it's kind of one of those light bulb things, and it goes along with how we're holding the release in our fingers. So how I said before, of not being buried in there and bending the hand. If you have a good set here and my hand is relatively flat, I'm going to want to anchor on these knuckles here, on my mid knuckles, in this zone. A lot of people try to anchor with the base knuckles on their hand, but I'm going to show you here, if I anchor with the base knuckles on my hand, that my hand, probably can see it from this angle better, my hand goes from wanting to be flat with these knuckles here to having to bend to get to these knuckles here. So you're either going to bend at the fingers here, and that's going to create some hinging and movement to where when you're actually executing and looking for consistency in your shot, that's harder to replicate than just normal biomechanically flat and straight. The other side of this is I go from it being anchored here to being anchored here, and I get a bend in my wrist. And my hand is then pulling this direction in a non-linear motion through my forearm and through my elbow. So when your hand is pulling in a non-linear position through your forearm and your elbow, you're actually going to not be pulling straight back anymore, and you're going to be inputting pressures on the bow and on the back of the arrow rather. So that's going to go back to kind of what we talked about before, is when you move the back of the arrow, you're affecting the flight of it in a much more massive way downrange. Now, this can give you, obviously, impacts downrange that are inconsistent, but it can also give you tuning problems too. So the thing that I go over and what I look for when I'm anchoring with a good solid anchor point is using the mid knuckles and then part of the finger right here. And then I try to keep my hand and leave it flat and keep it all straight throughout my wrist, all the way through my forearm and my elbow. And that's what's going to utilize the best way for me to anchor. Now, with that being said, your elbow in the straight line is sometimes going to be compromised based on the length of your loop or how far the string is coming back on your face. If your loop length is not correct, then the leverage over the bow is going to be incorrect for you as well. And what I mean by leverage over the bow is how high this rear elbow is your leverage. The higher the rear elbow, the more leverage you have to pull because your hand is further on your face, further forward rather. So you're going to be able to pull harder over the bow, and you can affect it a lot that way, which can be good in certain situations, but it's usually a lot worse. So I've talked about this in other videos, but I also have a complete instructional video over this, and it's part of my coaching program with the computer program that I've developed to show the correct links and the correct leverage points. But to give you kind of a quick overview, I did a lot of tests over a lot of different archers, a lot of professional archers, a lot of high-level amateurs, myself, and talked with some different people of what they were feeling. And the one thing that I noticed on everyone is a leverage line that's through that computer program that runs from our release elbow down to our bow arm's wrist. That leverage line intersects in the wrist zone for every single archer that I tested that is shooting the bow correctly and utilizing it with good scores and good consistency. Minus one person was Mike Slosher. He doesn't fall into that, but everybody else has. And the height of it is just the leverage amount and what you're looking at. But to kind of bring that back to the anchoring and what we were talking about on here, if the loop is too short or if it's too long, you have to start adjusting your wrist to take up the angle of the elbow. If you're too short, your elbow is outside of the correct line and being in the path of the arrow, so it's kind of sticking out here. And if it's too long, it comes around behind your head. So when you have that happen, it changes the wrist angle too. So there's a couple things to look at. Keep the wrist straight, keep the hand in a good flat natural position, and then you can kind of adjust and loop from there. If you need some more guidance on that, I offer that as a portion of a coaching package. It's cheaper, segmented down, but I'd be happy to look at that and help you with that too. All right, now we get to my favorite part to talk about. All the steps that we've done to this point all lead up to being able to help and aid you in your shot execution, which is what we're going to talk about right now. Now, with the hinge, you're going to get a lot of different opinions, and you're going to get a lot of different, ideas and ways to work through a hinge to execute a shot. Most people are going to tell you with the hinge release, because it is that mechanical release and the way that it works, it needs rotation. You have to manipulate the release. And in truth, you do have to manipulate the release some. That is true, because that release has to rotate in order for your shot to happen. The way that we go about achieving that rotation can be different for every individual. But my opinion is that the least amount of human perceived motion or movement in our hand is going to be best for you long range. And the reason that I say that is because if you start trying to relax your index and just focusing on relaxing the index, or focusing on manipulating the release by rotating through it with your outer fingers, or bending the wrist or something of that nature, when you start focusing on those points, then you start timing your shot, and you almost start what you would do with an index release as a punch. And it can create some target panic and some other issues. Now, with that being said, a lot of people will tell you with a hinge release that you need to just pull through your shot, and that's all you need to do. Now, for me, I pull through the shot. That's my focal point, and that's what I'm looking. I can shoot a hinge release the exact same way that I would shoot a resistance release, like the Carter Silverback or Evolution or the Stand Element. The reason that I can do that is because I allow the natural rotation of the release to happen. So I'm in a positive standpoint, which is what I call it, to where there's still some natural rotation left before I execute. And because I've set my finger pressures up the correct way that we've talked about in the video, and I've adjusted the speed of the hinge to work to where my execution happens. Now, in the reality of the situation, as I'm pulling through, the release is rotating. Now, whether that's because my elbow is coming back around behind my head because of the natural movement of the shoulder and the shoulder blade contracting back into the spine, or if you want to look at it more as me just pulling straight back, and as I'm doing that, my index is loosening a little bit on its pressure and the middle finger is kind of taking up the slack and it's happening. Or if you want to look at it as me pulling with more like a middle finger focus to pull my middle finger back into the wrist and the wrist back into the elbow, and bam. You can look at that in a lot of different ways. But the way that I'm doing it is just focusing on getting it full draw and then just pulling straight through. Now, one thing that I tell the people that I coach and that I work with is find your focal point that works for you. For me, my focal point is literally, because I use a 2-finger release and my palm is off the release, I focus on taking my palm and pulling it into my wrist, and my wrist being pulled into my elbow, and all of that allows it to go back. It's a smooth movement, it's slow, it's not a fast jerk, and it's not something that can be considered a punch or cause me issues downrange. Because what I'm doing is, when I shoot, I get an anchor and I utilize myself building tension to create a steadier sight picture, and then I'm pretty much just maintaining that and just very slightly increasing it in order for me to execute my shot. That's how it works best for me. So some archers, if you're using a hinge release, need to think of pulling the outside of the hand into their wrist, or pulling their wrist into their elbow, or pulling their elbow straight back behind them. Some need to think of other things, but find your focal point that works best for you so that as you're executing your shot, you're gonna have consistency without feeling like you need to move your fingers or your hand or your wrist to manipulate the release.